The motion be agreed to. Jacinda Ardern.
I note that the Minister, Mr Speaker, in his address said that this bill was aimed at giving families the financial certainty that would be beneficial to them and their newborn babies at that really crucial stage of development. But let's be honest, it doesn't do that for everyone. In fact, as we have pointed out through the early stages of this debate, the most vulnerable families and children remain untouched by this government's proposal tonight. And that, amongst other things, will be the most significant defining feature, apart from the fact that our package runs for longer, reaches more people and is more generous. Aside from all of those fundamental features, one of the most significant is the fact that the national government's policy leaves vulnerable families absolutely untouched. And that if, as they have purported in their general statements to this House, that their budget is targeted, Mr Speaker, targeted to vulnerable families and children, how is it that the poorest families in New Zealand are excluded from this bill? How can that be? That demonstrates to me, Mr Speaker, that this budget has been more about rhetoric than it has been about practice. I want to also point out, Mr Speaker, that in comparison to Labour's Best Start package, which fundamentally aimed to treat as many children as possible equally in terms of the assistance it gave families, the only children and families excluded from the Best Start package were those families who earned over $150,000. And even then, those ones might have been eligible for paid parental leave and could have received paid parental leave. The only ones outside of paid parental leave who were excluded were families who earned a combined income in the year that they were taking leave of $150,000. So not a large number of families, about roughly 5%. Under national, the families who are excluded are basically the ones who are earning roughly less than $20,000 per annum. What a telling story that is, Mr Speaker. So I'll let that speak for itself. I wanted to see then, in that context, what kind of issues were raised in the Bill of Rights analysis of the bill that we're debating tonight, because it says under the departmental disclosure statement, which we received late this afternoon, that advice had been provided to the Attorney-General on whether any provisions of the bill appear to limit any of the rights and freedoms affirmed in the Bill of Rights Act 1990. And it said, yes, that information had been provided and we could find that advice on the website. I'd like to just raise with the Minister and officials, despite my searches, I have been unable to find that analysis on the Ministry of Justice website, and I would implore the government that if it is indeed available, it would be very beneficial to members of this side of the House if that were tabled in the House. All of the regulatory impact statements have been tabled at the same time of the bill, but the last time I checked, I hadn't seen the BORA. I will check again for that Bill of Rights assessment, but it would be very useful if members on this side of the House had that available to us. But as I said, I have had the opportunity, Mr Speaker, to look at the regulatory impact statements, and particularly I found very useful the statement that was provided by the Department. I believe this one is provided by the Department of Labour. These statements are very useful, Mr Speaker. They basically, if I were to assess what they were doing, they basically give the kind of analysis that often is provided in a cabinet paper. So it tends to look at the problem definition. It then often will provide some analysis of the pros and cons of different options that may or may not have been presented to a minister. The giveaway often that it's not exactly the same as probably those early briefing papers is that often the analysis, the regulatory impact statement will often hone in on one option, and it'll be the one the government's gone for. So that's a little clue that sometimes they're being written after the fact. But I find it interesting that the Department of Labour has included the following statements under what it calls problem definition when looking at the issue of extra support for new families. And I quote, it states, currently, some families experience poor outcomes due to financial pressure on working mothers to return to the workforce earlier than is desirable for health and social reasons. It then goes on to say that some of the examples of this are, for instance, quote, suboptimal bonding between parents and their children, leading to poorer outcomes for children and therefore society. Secure attachment is an important predictor of resilience in later life, and a large body of evidence suggests that many adolescent difficulties, including crime, substance abuse and mental health, have their beginnings, Mr. Speaker, in early childhood. And I want to point out, Mr. Speaker, the footnote for this piece of research and evidence comes directly from Sir Peter Gluckman, his piece in May 2011 on improving the transition, reducing social and psychological morbidity during adolescence. All of the statements made in the problem definition by the Department of Labour this side of the House would absolutely agree with. It was the founding principles for the Best Start payment. I want to, though, just ask the question, does suboptimal bonding between parents and their children leading to poorer outcomes and secure attachment as an important predicator of resilience in later life, does that stop becoming an issue at 18 weeks? That's surely the fundamental question we should be asking, because the government has said, oh yes, we accept maybe 14 weeks, it might be contributing to the problem. An extra 4 weeks, that should do it. Is it enough? Well, if we look at the rest of the evidence that the Department of Labour has pulled out, it goes on to say, reduced health and development benefits of not achieving the World Health Organisation's recommendation of exclusive breastfeeding for the first 6 months, e.g. improved outcomes to mother and specific benefits to babies, such as improved cognitive development and visual acuity, reduced risks of types 1 and 2 diabetes, reduced childhood obesity and colic disease, reduced mortality during the first year of life, and long-term benefits for cardiovascular health. That comes from the American Academy of Pediatrics. That, Mr. Speaker, is a reference to 6 months of paid parental leave, not 18 weeks. And wait, there is more. From the Australian Productivity Commission on paid parental leave, and I want to point out to just the members who may have just arrived, I'm actually reading from advice provided to the government by a government department. No problem, Mr. Sabin. It then goes on to say, not achieving child and maternal health and welfare benefits from the primary caregiver having a minimum of 6 months leave. Again, 6 months leave. The benefits include better health outcomes for mothers and infants and better developmental outcomes for children, including cognitive benefits and reduced rates of infant mortality. The Australian Productivity Commission reports there is compelling evidence of these benefits from a period of absence of work for the primary caregiver of around 6 months. And a reasonable prospect that longer periods, 9 to 12 months, are beneficial. Mr. Speaker, the advice that was provided to the government pointed strongly to 26 weeks, the very amount of paid parental leave that Labor has strongly advocated for. And yet, what options were put to the government? Not 6 months. No, not 26 weeks. Instead, it was always the extension of just 4 weeks. And why? What was the rationale in the paper? It said, the Protection 6 months paid leave amendment bill currently before Parliament, which seeks to extend PPL from 14 to 26 weeks in 3 stages, basically said that it was something that they weren't putting forward as an option because of the prioritisation of budget allocations. Let me say this. Peter Gluckman has pointed out in this report that a poor attachment, poor health outcomes through lack of breastfeeding, all of the other resilient issues and psychological issues that come about from poor early development cost more than 6 months of paid parental leave will ever cost. It was about investing to save, and that is where this bill, Mr. Speaker, has failed.
David Bennett.
Mr. Speaker, contrary to that